Welcome to the Carver Project's inaugural Carver Conversation. On behalf of the board, I'm delighted you're here. My name is Shelley Milligan. I'm the chair of the board. Before I forget, we'd like to thank Third Baptist Church and especially Tom Kurtz for their warm welcome and hospitality. Could we have a round of applause? Thank you. Tonight we are all here to introduce the Carver Project, which is a new nonprofit ministry. It's a community of scholars, students, and friends at Washington University in St. Louis that exists for three reasons: to equip faculty at the intersection of Christian faith and academic calling, to provide expertise to culturally engaged pastors and ministry leaders, and to cultivate the next generation of leaders in the university and beyond. Tonight's conversation will illustrate our core values of uncommon community, focused engagement, and creative dialogue. I'm excited to serve on the board of the Carver Project because of these values. I've learned firsthand in my own life the value of community, even across, and maybe especially across, great difference. The Lord builds families in all kinds of ways, and Christian community is one of his biggest gifts to us. Engaging with this community in various settings brings great meaning and purpose to my life, and I sincerely believe that relationship built through dialogue is the most important means through which we are challenged, change happens, and community is built. Our panelists here tonight are an artist, a pastor, and a scholar. Our conversation will begin with discussion between these possibly unlikely collaborators. But what we're most excited about is that the last portion of the evening will expand to a conversation with all of you, or at least some of you. You are important to our community, and we look forward to engaging you in new ways that will stretch all of us tonight and beyond. Okay, I'm going to take just a quick minute to introduce our panelists who are here, I promise. And I know many of you have read about these folks, as have I. It's a great honor to have Tim Keller in St. Louis. Many of you have read his books, listened to his sermons, followed his career. Tim is formerly pastor of Redeemer Church in New York City. He's now working with a ministry called Redeemer City to City. And his time with us tonight here at the Carver Project is one of maybe two events that he's traveling to this year apart from his work with Redeemer City to City. He believes in us that much, which is a huge treat. I first learned about Lecrae about 10 years ago, and I had, at the time, 4 awkward teenage boy cousins with whom I had nothing in common. And we were at a family reunion, and they wanted to play some music for me. And trying to build a relationship, I agreed. And sure enough, they played Lecrae for me. That was my introduction to Lecrae. And my 4 boy cousins were so excited about this dope rapper who could talk about his relationship with the Lord. Lecrae told me tonight he wants to change the world. So you're in the middle of that with him. John Anazu is a law professor at Washington University. He is a good friend. And I have it on good word that there are 2 things you should know about him. One is that he loves dessert and will stop a business trip, a trip home from school, many places to find a good dessert. And he is also a strategic board game enthusiast. I'm sure he's thrilled that I said that. And our moderator tonight is Kirsten Powers from CNN. She is delighted to be here as well. She's here because she actually became a Christian in Tim Keller's church. She, as an adult, will tell you that she started going there with a boyfriend who said, you know, we can't really get much closer unless you are open to becoming a Christian. At which point she said, well, I'm not, but I'm a liberal, secular atheist, so I'm open. And so she started going to Redeemer, and over the course of about a year, came to know the Lord. which is pretty exciting. So she's here to moderate, and I'm so excited for all of us, and selfishly for me too. So would you please join me in welcoming our panel?
We haven't done anything yet.
That was all for me, Ray. Yeah, so thank you everyone for being here, and I think we should just jump right in. We build this event as characterizing our current moment as a fractured age driven by fear, isolation, and selfishness. So I guess my question to each of you is, do you think that that's an accurate description of the climate we're living in right now? Tim?
Oh, okay. I'll start. I think part of the fractured age is Christian's fault, but I think we'll wait on that, as long as you promise you'll bring that up later. Will you?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. I think that in the last 70, 80 years, there's been I'll just quote some names. I'm not trying to impress everybody, but I'm trying to do some shorthand here. And there have been people like Philip Reef, Robert Bella, Christopher Lasch, Alistair McIntyre, Charles Taylor. These are all philosophers, sociologists. And all of them have said that the modern society is based on a very new idea. Other cultures have never come up with this. And that is the idea of the radical freedom of the individual. That every other culture has always said that your moral source, in other words, everybody has to say, how do you decide right or wrong? So everybody's got some way of answering that question. How do I know right from wrong? That's my moral source. Every other culture always had a moral source outside. So Confucius said it was heaven. Muslims say it's the Quran. Christians say it's the Bible. But the modernity, let's say, is the first culture in history that says, no, the moral source is completely inside you. There's nothing outside that I have to bow to if I feel this is right, if I feel this is wrong. So my moral source is inside. That means there's no unifying values in society. There's no unifying moral source that we all are beholden to. And all those thinkers say that this essentially eats away at our ability to do anything together. Politically, you start to fragment because there's no single story Americans can tell that across the political parties we all agree on. We just disagree on how to get there, but we don't even agree on what we're trying to do. It's the reason why universities no longer know what the mission is. As soon as you start talking about character or all the things we talked about in the past, no, we can't do that because everybody has to define right or wrong for themselves. And you have greater inequality, I think, in the economic world, partly because of individualism. You've got family breakdown because of individualism. So all those thinkers all have said that it's worked through slowly, but an awful lot of the fragmentation and the disunity is inevitable to the very idea of modern society. So I think they're all right, even as different as they all are. That doesn't mean Christians haven't contributed. So that's a start.
Well, so Lecrae, it does feel like there's something's different, right? It doesn't feel like it's always been this way. I think it's fair to say that we probably have been building towards this over time. But how do you see our current culture? Do you feel we are as divided and isolated as?
I think there's more of an awareness of, it's a lot of the things that we're seeing now are really symptomatic of a disease that's already been there. It's been there. It's just very visible because of cultural changes, political changes, things that, especially in political climate, when that comes into play, you begin to see the fracture a lot more clearly. When people have an issue that they're not centered around, then people begin to divide and realize, oh, we were never on the same. I thought we were more than what we are.
Yeah.
And so I think what you're seeing the symptom of something that's been there underneath
Yeah.
the surface, and there's certain things that are bringing it to fruition and allowing us to recognize and realize we're fractured. I think also in that reality, in that realization of division, and we retreat and we find our clans and our tribes, and we look for solutions. And as Tim was referring to, we look for solutions. In this age, I feel like we find ourselves focusing on self-esteem more, and thinking, not that thinking that I think too less of myself. And so there's an esteem of self, an esteem of my views and my perspective over someone else's. And instead of having a moral standard, having a plumb line, having a God that says, hey, this is what that should look like, and we move in that direction, we begin to develop our own perspectives and ideas of what that is.
Right. And so, like Lecrae was just saying, these problems have been revealed, right? And so, I mean, what is your, I guess I just want to get everybody's sort of take on this. Like, where do you think we are right now? And is it that much different than it was in the past? Or, is it just, people always say, oh, when I was young, or, or this is the worst. Is this the worst? Or is...
I do think I agree with Lecrae that a lot of this is a greater awareness of differences that actually exist, and part of that is when different people who were not given voice in the past now have voice, you have a better awareness of the difference, but the more difference you have, the less consensus you can assume. And so then to your point, not just about universities, but we have these massive questions. What's the purpose of our country? What's the purpose of a human being? What's the common good? And we don't agree on these questions. And that seems newish because it's been surfaced in this certain way.
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting because we are an overwhelmingly Christian country, right? So how does it come to be that we have so much disagreement about this if most people say they believe in God and most people identify as Christians? Tim?
Well, there's obviously a decreasing number of people that identify as Christians all the time. I just read Barna, the Barna group came out with a profile of what they call Gen Z. They've also, I think Gene Twing calls it the iGen, basically teenagers or under 22. What they found was that 14% of teenagers identify as atheists, which is like 3.5 times more than the population. You never know whether that'll last, but I mean, that clearly means Christianity is declining in influence. I think that's pretty agreed upon, which of course means then it can't speak with quite as unifying a voice, and therefore there's just more diversity.
Well, you asked me to ask about Christians' role in this, so how much of a role is that? Do you think Christian behavior feeds into that? I mean, why do you think people are becoming atheists at a higher
So you're going to start with me
rate?
again, but I did ask you to.
Hey, you invited me.
Well, no. I got to say, there's so much to say that I'll just give one part. I know that John Lecrae will add. In fact, I even kind of know what they're going to add, but I'll tell you what I can say. Well, Mark Knoll, a historian, wrote a great book called, or he wrote more than one book on this subject. He wrote a book called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. And he said Christianity in the country, especially from the 1830s to the 1840s, in fact, he even would say evangelical Christianity was really on the verge of becoming the nation's religion. But then evangelicals who believed the Bible, suddenly they started reading the Bible over slavery, and lo and behold, if you came from a state where your economy was not based on slave labor, you read the Bible and says, oh no, the Bible doesn't say slavery's okay. But if you came from a state where the economy was completely based on slave labor, you said, no, look, the Bible says slaves obey your masters. And what Mark Knoll said was, it was very clear that people who said, we are people of the book, we let the Bible's our authority, they were not letting the Bible critique their social location, their culture. They were using the Bible to justify their culture. And he said, as a result, we had to have a war. He says, because basically the Christian church failed the country, couldn't say, let's see what the Bible says and agree. We actually had, you might say, we had the chops, as it were. That is, the Christian church was very, very strong in the country, and they couldn't agree. They clearly were just using the Bible, and we had to have a war. And Mark says that, he says, there's no way that the Christian church, and then of course you have segregation in the South, which is the legacy of that. And he says the Christian church has never really had the moral authority since, nor maybe it should have. And so that's just one small contribution, but there's a whole lot of stuff we've been doing more recently too. So I'll end with that.
Yeah, Lecrae.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is a lot of cultural, nuances and implications and ideas being pushed on the scriptures instead of scriptures pushing back on us. If I were to say, I remember first time I read in the scriptures, the throat is an open grave. My idea is a graveyard and a grave there, and oh man, I might walk into that. So that's why it's dangerous, because I'm reading my own cultural context into that scripture, when graves at that time were like caves and walls. So if it's an open grave, I'm going to smell a stench. And that's the idea, is it stinks. And so instead of me reading my own culture into the text, I need to let the text breathe into my culture. And I think Christians in today's age have, the Christianity, especially as we're experiencing in America, is more American than Christian in a lot of instances. And so there's a more embrace of nationalism, and irregardless of what that may mean for, the least of these, or what that may mean for the idea of the Good Samaritan. And so you begin to, instead of living in the tension of caring about stewarding your country and caring for the least of these, or the Good Samaritan, we will ignore what seems to be insignificant in light of what the culture, where the culture is going, and what the culture esteems and what the culture praises. And so I think that's a lot of how we've contributed, Christians have contributed to what we're seeing now.
And one of the things did you want to say something, Tim?
No.
Oh, okay. One of the things that I've always been sort of amazed by, I work in the media and it's very secular, is how much there still really is this desire to see moral Christian leadership. And so I'll even see with people who aren't believers saying, when they see evangelicals doing something, well, Christians aren't supposed to do that, are they? Or why are they saying this? Or the way they reacted to Pope Francis, where people became so enthralled with him. So, is there a way, I guess, for Christians to regain this moral leadership, or is it just lost?
Lecrae gave a roadmap, right?
Yeah.
Get out of fear, get out of self-interest, but we're not seeing that. So one of my areas is religious freedom, and the number of Christians who turn that into a special interest. Religious freedom for me, but not for thee. Right? We heard from Tish Warren earlier today about Christians being kicked off of Vanderbilt, and 2 hours away, the mosque being denied the permit. And Christians very concerned about Vanderbilt and not concerned about the mosque. But religious freedom only works if it's for everybody. And that's when we start to move out of fear and out of self-interest for the sake of our neighbor.
Right. Well, that speaks to the fact that a lot of Christians feel under siege. They feel under attack. They think that, their rights are being taken away, that the culture is against them. Tim, do you think that's a fair description? I saw some headline on Fox News the other day of, will I be allowed to be a Christian in a couple years or something? And this is like a real thing that people are feeling, that they're really under siege. Is this paranoia, or is there something to this?
Oh yeah. It's paranoia, and there's something to it.
Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're really after you.
Right. Well, first, it's such an insult to many of our Christian friends, brothers and sisters, depending on who you are, around the world, who are actually suffering. They generally, every so often, sometimes their homes are burned, or their churches are burned, and things like that. So we really have to be careful. It's paranoia. But John's example, where here's a Christian group thrown off a college campus. So in some ways, I don't think 50 years ago that would have happened. So that is diminishing clout. But then, just a few miles away, Christians are keeping a group of Muslims from building a house of worship, which means they still have a lot of clout elsewhere. So it depends on where you are. And you certainly know at certain places in Silicon Valley or Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Manhattan, there's not a lot of clout for Christians, and there actually can be a social cost to saying I'm a Christian, and there's plenty of other places where they've got plenty of clout. So it's both paranoia and there's something to it.
But yeah, and I guess the question in that case is, how are Christians supposed to respond to that, even if it really is happening, right? Because aren't Christians supposed to be persecuted? It doesn't mean you should just roll over for it, but does it mean you should seek power? What do you think, Lecrae, is the right way to react to that? The fact that there are legitimate encroachments, there's no question.
Yeah, if again, the subjectivity of what we're calling persecution, makes, I guess it depends on what we're thinking persecution is, because on one hand, a lot of people would see something as persecution that's really just, it's like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of some law or something that's been passed and Christians stood for it and it didn't work and they feel like they're being persecuted. Or I'll give you a good example. Someone's protesting my concert. And and on both ends of the spectrum, right? Like, do I feel persecuted? I don't. I mean, it's fine. Do they feel persecuted because they're being ignored and no one? And I'm sure for that guy outside protesting, he felt like he's being persecuted. Like, yeah, this is great, and I'm really standing firm. And so I do think in some of the decisions, that are made in a vacuum that I think Christians are making, they feel as if this is authentic persecution. But then on a whole other end of the spectrum, what about the gospel implications of someone caring for, a people group and being bombasted or excluded from these Christian circles? Is that persecution as well? And so I think there's a lot of subjectivity. Of course, it's nothing, I mean, not to say it doesn't exist here in America, but it's going to be nothing like what we may have seen in Syria or anywhere else.
Yeah. Well, and so I think it's true, the persecution word gets tossed around a little bit too much when you consider what's happened in the Middle East. But if we talk about the feeling under siege thing, I think what people would say is that they feel that they can't hold orthodox views about sexuality, or they can't oppose abortion, or whatever things that they feel are core. And if they're, for example, on a university, an Ivy League university campus, that they feel ostracized, or maybe even they're not allowed to organize. How do you see that issue? Do you see this as something that people should be pushing back and fighting against, or that they should just be turning the other cheek?
We can talk about an almost Ivy League university, right?
Yeah.
Here at Washington University,
Yeah.
I think there are some pressure points, but my concern, I think description really matters here, and how we describe things matters. And there are plenty of bonkers scenarios that happen that make me feel uncomfortable, that make me feel maybe I wouldn't be able to say that, but they're interspersed in 24-hour days, 7 days a week, where a lot of really normal, good stuff happens. And so to see the university as a place under siege would be to misdescribe it. To say that there is something happening and that there are some pressure points to be aware of is important. But the problem, I think, is there are certain filters and media filters that show only the siege piece, and that becomes the description that starts to define reality for a lot of people.
Right. Well, and I also think it depends on where you are. I've always find it interesting that, I became a believer in Tim Keller's church, and in New York City, and in New York City, it's not very cool to be a Christian, really. I mean, maybe unless you're Tim or something, but it's not. So to me, it always came with a cost. And so, but I think for a lot of people who live in other places, maybe in the Midwest or in the South or something, that's actually a benefit, right? And so now suddenly they're not the dominant group anymore, and they're not liking it. I mean, do you think that that's a fair analysis? I mean, one of the other complaints that they would make is there's been all this controversy about whether, they should have to serve gay couples, bake a cake for them for their wedding, or the photographer, those kinds of things. I mean, how do you see these issues, Tim?
Well, it's as a pastor, I don't want to bind people's consciences, which means I do think in general, if somebody's conscience says I can't do that, I think there's some places in the Bible that say, even if you personally think that that shouldn't be a problem, or wouldn't be for you, I don't want to bind other people's consciences. But as a general rule, since Christians, in the past, the Christian point of view was sort of in charge in this country, if you try to assert and say, I should be able to, as a Christian, be free to do this or that, it certainly looks like you're trying to turn the clock back. Maybe you're not. Maybe that's not your motive at all. But it certainly appears that you're trying to go back to the 1950s or something like that. So probably it would be better for Christians to get a reputation for being, as a whole, very being big advocates for other minorities rather than themselves. It feels more like the spirit of Christ to say, we're not really going to be constantly putting up our dukes about this or that freedom. What we are really going to be known as the people who care about minorities in this country of all sorts. And at a certain point, people might say, oh, maybe you actually are in a service mode, not just trying to take power back. Now, don't ask me about individual cases because that's not that easy to judge.
Yeah. What do you think, Lecrae? What do you think about that?
I totally agree. I think, in regard to, just being in an art community and understanding there's all types of, it's not cool to be a Christian in an art community, period. So I constantly am in spaces and places where they're like, so what are you made of? So it's as if I'm some alien life form. But again, I'm constantly changing the narrative by doing the things that I do think God calls us to do, but seem countercultural to what people believe about Christians, because they, standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves and caring about other people's rights and considering, all these different things that seem like they're not a part of our narrative, which they really are a part of our narrative, but, that hasn't, hospitals, all of those particular things are, because of the influence of Christians, but I do agree we've got to begin to pick up the mantle of looking like service, like we're here to walk in the footsteps of Jesus.
Right. And so, John, you're a professor, and so you're dealing with, a lot of these issues on campuses, and you were saying that it's mostly good things that are happening, you feel? And I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, because I don't think people hear that. I think people think, oh, a Christian professor, it must just be, you're just constantly persecuted. That would be sort of the storyline that we would get.
Right, and there are some things happening that are challenging, but there are plenty of Christians. Part of what the Carver Project is bringing a bunch of Christians at Washington University together and saying, we're here, we're not going anywhere, we actually love this place, we do pretty well here, we want to serve this place, and we have some interesting things to say, right? And in the midst of that, to be confident and to be hopeful and to be empathetic, I think that I hear some people sometimes describe elite higher ed as the place where Christians are under siege. And there are some crazy things that happen, and there are some backdoor meetings about faculty hiring and those kinds of things. But that doesn't corrupt the entire enterprise. And I think there's a lot of good in the university.
Well, so it's true, we hear about this all the time. So do you think it's that other people are being too in your face about it, or is it because they're conservative, or is it, I don't think they're making it up, right? They obviously are encountering, obviously you're doing something right, truly. So how are you engaging people in a way that they're not feeling threatened?
Well, and I don't want to diminish it, because they're not, there are problems, and people aren't making it up, but when all you hear about are the problems, you form a narrative or a description of what this place is that's just not accurate. And I think part of it is, there are people who are unfairly marginalized or stigmatized for their views, and there are issues in the university where that happens, and there are departments where that happens. But it doesn't corrupt the entire
Right.
enterprise. And I think
Yeah.
part of it, and this is probably generalizable outside of the university, but we ought to start with, when I got to Washington University, I was telling myself, I want to win friends and not arguments first, and to make friends with my colleagues who I was going to disagree with. And I think, as part of this is just be nice, right?
Yeah.
Be nice.
What a novel idea. Yeah.
And some people won't like you, and that's okay.
Right. Yeah, and I think that it's interesting because when I became a believer at Redeemer in Tim Keller's church, I get extra for that. But it was different. I mean, this was in 2006, and we were talking about this backstage, that I do feel like things have changed a bit, and I'm kind of curious, Tim, you being in New York City, I'm wondering if you have seen any kind of change in, and maybe because I was a little more defensive then, and now I've become a little more open about it and comfortable with it, and so I don't find people reacting as badly. But have you experienced, because when you first went to New York, didn't it feel fairly hostile?
Yes, so when people, I have heard people say, I think in general it's true that across the country there's more pushback against Christianity. I do think that, right? But I also remember, frankly, the big cities tend to be kind of forerunners. I actually do remember watching a movie when I was a teenager called Midnight Cowboy about some kind of basically a drug party in Greenwich Village. And I remember watching that thing just before I went to college, and I said, wow, that's just New York City. New York City. Never happened anywhere else. And about 3 years later, I was in college, and it was happening everywhere else, partly because it started in New York City. So when I got to New York, I was definitely felt an Orthodox Christian was a freak at best. Astounded if you had more than a third grade education. So I haven't found it a lot different. But when I've come out to visit the rest of the country, when I go home to friends or that sort of thing, I have noticed it becoming more like New York City all the time. But actually for 30 years...
In what way? What do you mean?
In the sense of, the fact that Gen Z is 14% atheist. I don't know what it is in New York City, but I'll bet you it's at least that.
Yeah.
So in other words, it used to be, if you were in New York City, maybe this is social media, by the way, which we may get to. If you're raised in New York City, you're raised in Iowa, that was very different. They're very different people. Now, teenagers in Iowa and teenagers in New York City are actually consuming the same stuff. And so what happens at that point is the sort of thing that used to be really avant-garde and strange and odd from New York and LA is everywhere. And so that's what I mean by saying I could just see that happening. And I think to some degree it's through social media.
But when you're interacting just with the average New Yorker, do you feel like they react sort of as shocked or surprised as they would have 20 years ago? Or do you feel like they're a little more maybe interested or curious?
Well, it depends on them. I think the questions change. So actually, 30 years ago, a lot of non-Christians would say to me, well, I just can't believe in miracles. That's why I'm not a Christian. They're rational.
Yeah.
That's not true anymore. It's more, for example, the Gen Z is more likely to say evil and suffering. I cannot accept to be a God if there's evil and suffering. 3 times more often than people my age. So evil and suffering's always been an objection. But you see what I'm saying? The objections change. And so you do have to keep abreast of that sort of thing. And in general, I have felt, though, that in New York, there's also a lot more questions now about politics and Christianity that wasn't true years ago for all the obvious reasons.
Right.
But in general, it's always been a difficult place to talk about Christianity. But the other thing is, the hardest thing is secular people, let's call it, it's fair to say, non-believing people don't think they have beliefs. They think they're just seeing things as they are. And they say, well, you've got faith, but I don't. I'm just rational. I just see things as they are. The biggest difficulty in New York is to get people, and actually I think you saw that.
Yeah.
I had to, in a sense, convince you, not personally, but through the preaching, that you had a set of beliefs too. You held a whole lot of things that by faith they couldn't be proven. They weren't self-evident to everybody in the world, so they were faith assumptions. and to ask, well, how consistent are they? And when you start to see your views that way, you begin to say, maybe they aren't. So it's always been basically the same process of trying to get New Yorkers to think about things like that. And it's a little different, but not really any harder or easier than it used to be.
Yeah, and Lecrae, I mean, what's your experience with that in terms of, also, I think there's this sort of baggage that comes, like people have ideas, not just about Christianity, but about Christians,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, how do you navigate that? You were saying like they sort of think you're weird or whatever. I think a lot of people here want to know how do I engage in a winsome way, in a way that doesn't alienate people.
Yeah, I think you're obviously the victim of caricatures that, you know, went before you and or out there currently that are the biggest picture of what a Christian looks like. You know, every time you watch a film, if there's a Christian representation, it's like the creepy priest guy
Right.
who's, you know, it's gonna be like the overly happy, giddy, you know, church family. It's just all these caricatures.
Right.
You know, it's gonna, you know, the old black guy with the wisdom.
The gravelly voice.
So,
Hallelujah.
so there's just these caricatures that, you know, this is the only time people have encountered Christians from a distance, and then when they encounter them up close and personal, it's usually their radical cousin who just got
Yeah,
saved and
exactly.
and you know,
It's crazy.
God bless them.
But not the best representation.
Right. And so these become the, you know, our caricatures. These become our representatives, and so you're constantly pushing back on what people have already experienced, and just dealing with that. I was in a studio session with a prominent artist, and he said, "So you're a Christian, right?" And I said, "Well, I follow the way." And he's like, "What?" I said, "Let's start there, and then we'll come back to what you asked me." And then I just took him down a different path that still led to Jesus, of course. And then I said, and so in Scripture we were called Christians because we followed the way, we followed the Christ, and that's the terminology. But I had to give him this whole historical backstory, because if I would have said, "Yes, I'm a Christian," he's like, "Yeah, I know exactly who you are. You're
Right.
this guy."
Yeah.
And so, you know, but I actually enjoy not from the standpoint of like people not knowing Jesus, but I enjoy the lack of encounters with Christians, or the secularization of cities, because for me, I get to start at ground zero with people, and I get to I don't have to deal with all the misconceptions and all these ideas, and they just get to encounter me, and I'm the first like example of what a Christian looks like, and we can really just begin to walk down that path.
Yeah, in a way I was lucky because I grew up in a really secular household, and so I didn't have, and then I encountered a lot of these other people that have all this, they were harmed by the church, they were hurt by the church. And so one of the other things that I think recently I've been thinking about a lot is that a lot of people that are angry are actually hurt. You know, they actually have been really legitimately hurt by the church. And I mean, is that something that you run into, where it's just, like behind the anger or the condescension is actually a lot of pain?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I've been hurt by the church plenty, post-Christian. And so I
Right.
can understand that. But I think it does, for me, it drives me deeper into the person of God, and helps me to see how compassionate he is, after all, to pay this price and to have these people as his representatives, and to love them, and to call them his children and his sheep. And I'm like, man, you are really good, because you know.
Yeah. And one of the things, I mean, maybe all of you could answer is, do you see any good role models for people to look at? Are there people that you see, other than the people on this stage, I guess, you know, whether Tim and Lecrae, who obviously are doing an amazing job, but no, but people who are in the public sphere who are modeling Christianity in a way that's people should emulate. Do you guys? Anybody?
I can think of some bad examples. I think when Christians are patient and kind and forgiving, right? Public acts of forgiveness show something remarkable to the world. And forbearance and repentance. I mean, this is not rocket science. We know this already, right? When we act like Christians in public. And so when we see acts of forgiveness in the midst of extreme tragedy, or we see patience when someone's ridiculing,
Right. You guys have anybody?
Well, you're asking for figures. I actually do think that there's, I think the most obvious thing to say is that there actually are tons and tons of individual Christians in every country, in every city, that actually are quite good models for, they're just not well known. And I don't think the early church, by the way, grew from 0 to 10% of the Roman world population in 200 years on the basis of preaching and celebrity, by the way. For example, as a matter of fact, it was actually dangerous to bring a non-Christian to church. So you basically tended to not do that because you never knew the person might come in and they say, oh, so this is where you meet. Good, we'll burn this place down. So it was actually all done through individual believers who actually created a community and lived lives that were admirable. And I actually do, there's still quite a lot of that, I see. I actually like what John said about the individual examples. My two favorite, events. My two favorite, of course, are the Charleston shooting and the forgiving by the African American Christians in Charleston. And then the Amish shooting about more than, I don't know how many years ago, 2004, where a shooter took school children hostage, killed quite a few of them, then killed himself. And the Amish community came around his wife, the shooter's wife and children, around the parents, came to the funeral and forgave them. And in both cases, there was it was a great witness, especially when people said, how do you do that? The Amish book, there was a book called Amish Grace put out by some sociologists that said that you really should not assume that anybody can just forgive like that. And because what he said, we have a culture, and I've talked about this, but we have a culture in which the one thing we teach in every public school is self-assertion. Don't let anybody tell you you can't do or be what you want. Stay angry, assert yourself, self-assertion. They said forgiveness is an act of self-denial. It is an act of self-denial. And we're teaching everybody in the world, here in our culture, to do self-assertion. So if somebody wrongs you and you really should forgive them, it'd be good for you psychologically, it'd be good for you in every other way. Actually, our culture doesn't create that. So what they said is, the Amish it's a worshiping community. They tell stories of Jesus. They talk about forgiveness. I said you have to be traditioned, catechized, formed into people who do know how to deny themselves and do know how to sacrifice for other people. And our culture can't do that. We're not creating people like that. So when Christians show that they can do some of those actions that are admirable, but that our society has forgotten how to do, that's a witness. So to me, that you've got the individual witnesses, and then you've got these occasional events where God makes it possible for people to say, maybe Christianity still has something.
And it's mind-blowing, right? Because Christian forgiveness doesn't require repentance even, and the world has no category for that.
Right.
Reconciliation needs both, and we're
Yeah.
short on reconciliation, but the power of forgiveness that says, I forgive you because I'm called to, because Jesus died for me.
Right, forgive me, just to say, somebody out there is going to say, no, wait a minute, doesn't the Bible say if they repent, you forgive them?
That's for God.
Mark 11:25, Jesus says, if you stand praying and you have anything against anybody, you forgive them. So in other words, Jesus says, it's great if they repent, it's great for them, and actually easier for you. But that doesn't mean as a Christian you're not supposed to forgive them. You forgive them whether they repent or not. So, because whenever somebody says something like what John just said, I always get some pushback saying, no, you shouldn't forgive anybody unless they repent. No, Mark 11:25, take that. Sorry.
Tim has some great sermons on forgiveness, actually, so highly recommend. I'm actually being totally serious. I mean, some of his best, he has a couple of really wonderful sermons on forgiveness. But I think, Tim, I want to transition maybe to a different area of discussion and talk a little bit about, maybe a little bit of politics. And you recently were at a gathering of evangelical leaders and we're talking about red evangelicalism and blue evangelicalism. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that and what you meant by that.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I feel like I'm talking a little bit too much here. What I meant by that is that sometimes we are more, sometimes we're more animated by our culture, which we read into the Bible, than we are animated by the Bible, critiquing the culture. So here's two examples. Red evangelicalism, of course, means people who are Christians who become conservative politically. I absolutely believe that for Christian reasons, you could, thoughtful biblical Christian reasons, you could occupy a number of different places on the spectrum. I do not believe the Bible says, for example, we're supposed to care about the poor. There can be legitimate disagreements as to what is the best social policy for the poor, what is the best tax structure for the poor. So so you could be conservative for biblical reasons because you've decided this is the way to honor those biblical mandates. But when there is a kind of red evangelicalism in which the idolatry of nation, that is to say, you kind of make an idol out of the nation, America more important than anything else, where actually being in America is more important than being a Christian. So you're reading that in. Blut und Boden, which is blood and soil, which was, of course, a kind of forerunner to Nazism, that basically said race and soil are the most important things, and then Christianity has to work into that. So you could be a red evangelical, not for biblical reasons, even though you use the Bible to justify yourself. But you're basically making an idol out of your country. On the other hand, you could be a blue evangelical, in that even though you're all for justice, you're basically more animated by, you might say, liberal individualism. The idea that, and see, Martin Luther King Jr. did not say, the reason why we ought to end segregation is so that everybody should be free to live their life the way they see fit and create their own meaning. He said no, because the Bible says, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. So there's a kind of blue evangelicalism where you're more animated by the modern individualism. And here's the way you know. A blue evangelical who is more controlled by the culture than the Bible will talk a lot about racial justice, but does not want to go where the Bible goes on sexuality. They just won't talk about it. Because what the Bible says about sexuality mitigates against individualism. It says, no, you can't just do anything you want with your body. And a conservative evangelical who's more controlled by conservative idolatries than by the Bible will talk a lot about the gay agenda and says, we're just tired of talking about race. We've heard enough about that. So one of the ways you can tell you're more in the grip of the culture than the Bible is that you won't talk about both those things. Because both those things do not fit into either an idolatry of nation or an idolatry of the individual self. And I don't know, I'm not saying, by the way, some people accuse me of saying there's as many blue evangelicals as red evangelicals. That's not true. So I'm not trying to do that. But basically, I do think that's something we ought to talk about. Sorry, that was kind of a long answer.
Yeah, I mean, but Lecrae, I see you nodding a lot, and we were also talking about in the backstage about sort of another group of people, maybe we could call them purple evangelicals. I don't know. People who don't fit into either category, and I think you kind of see yourself that way.
Yeah.
I mean, is that maybe a third way to be approaching things?
Yeah, I think one of the problem is when you don't embrace one aspect of this particular group, then they immediately accuse you of being a part of this particular group.
Yeah.
And when you don't embrace an aspect of this particular group, they accuse you of being a part of this one. And the reality is we don't we're not given the freedom to agree with aspects of both of these and not necessarily be fully embracing that. And so, I experienced that personally by, raising my hand on the injustices that I was seeing in society and in our country. But people knew me for, caring about or being pro-life or whatnot. And so they said, you can't do that. And I'm like, no, I can. I'm pro-life.
Watch me. Watch me. Here I am doing it.
Do it.
Yeah.
Watch me.
I can.
Yeah.
So a friend of mine talks about a cross-shaped gospel, and the idea of that is that you don't have to, one aspect of the cross is the vertical, and is acknowledging God's truth and what he says about these particular aspects of culture and who he is and his holiness and his greatness. And then the other aspect is the horizontal aspect of that cross, which talks about the social and societal issues that we're seeing. And you can't have one part of the cross and not the other. You've got to have the entire thing in order to have a complete gospel picture. And so to be on one end of the spectrum and not on the other end, you're not embracing the fullness of what I believe God has called us to.
John.
Well, I'll just add to that when you're not pure in either direction politically, you're going to be with uncommon and uncomfortable allies, and you're going to have to search to find the common ground. And that doesn't mean you agree or endorse everything, but I think too many of us are just way too scared of signaling any kind of common ground because that's going to be approval or guilt by association. But actually, we need uncommon alliances, and we can learn from other people, right? We've got a lot to learn from other people of other faiths, people of no faiths. Part of being a Christian in the world is encountering the image of God in the people around us. And that's not a relativist claim, but it's a claim that God is at work out there, and we have a lot to learn.
I guess this is gonna have to be our last round because I'm getting the cue to wrap. But I want to just ask you, Lecrae, about what you just alluded to, sort of the experience that you had when you came out and started talking about police brutality and the reaction that you got from a lot of white evangelicals. What advice would you give to people who want to learn? People who actually are in a posture of, wow, I don't get this, and I want to learn how to get it.
Yeah. That's a class. I think on one end of the spectrum, for a lot of my white friends, brothers and sisters, they don't wake up having to think about race, having to think about what it means to be a minority, because they don't wake up as a minority. And so I wake up every day black. It's Black History Month every month for me. And so because of that, I'm having to see things from a lens constantly that my white brothers and sisters are never having to consider, never having to see. And I think because we live in a society, the world as we know it has been colonized mostly by white Europeans, and so we look at life through that particular lens. And because of that, it's rare for my white brothers and sisters to sit under the authority of a person of color. And so authority means you've submitted to authority, right? You're an authority on a subject because you've submitted to someone who is an authoritative on that subject, and now you're informed. And so I think part of it is saying, let me submit myself to some authorities on the issues of race and justice, because I'm not, right? Because I only see what I see. And if enough people, it's just sitting and reading and asking questions and asking for book lists and saying, where can I, and doing the research on yourself, Google, it's just, hey, where can I start to learn? But I think the biggest thing is having empathy and being willing to sit at the feet of people who live this, who know this, who drink it and eat it and sleep it, and then being able to say, okay, now then what should I do in light of what I've learned?
Yeah, I'm always amazed when I see people arguing, when Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote his book, and then you have white columnists telling him why he's wrong. And I'm like, this is like me arguing with a mathematician or something, right? It's like, how could you possibly know more about this than him? And that you do need to really, I think, like you said, learn from people who actually have experienced it. So we have some questions from the audience. So the first question is, can we still use the word evangelical?
What are you looking at? You are all looking at
you.
me.
Yeah,
Wait a minute. Everybody needs to answer this question, and I will only go first under that condition.
I'll enforce it.
Okay,
I will
Miss
enforce
Interlocutor,
it.
you
Yes,
make sure they
I will
answer.
enforce it.
I think because around the world, virtually every country, in every language, there is this term evangelical, obviously. There is a global evangelical movement. It does mean something somewhat different in other countries. But I don't think it's fair for American evangelicals to say, the brand's not working. Let's find another label.
Yeah, let's do a relaunch.
And then, I'm not sure that I don't know that we have the right to do that. And it's a very typical white American thing to think we do. But we're part of a global movement and a family, a multi-ethnic, politically and racially diverse family. And a lot of American evangelicals don't know that. And so I don't think that we can just walk away from the word, but in spite of the fact that I actually think there's huge problems now with using it publicly in various ways. So I think we have to be very judicious in the way we use it. But on the other hand, I don't think we can just completely abandon it, but that's my thoughts.
I definitely want to hear what you think about it, and also maybe a little bit about how do you handle the fact that the word means one thing to evangelicals and it means another thing to the culture, right? So how do you, when you say I'm an evangelical to the broad culture, they're thinking something completely different than what Tim was talking about.
Yeah, I think from my understanding, the term is used to espouse a particular kind of, set of beliefs and things that you are in line with as a Christian. And I think categories are good, right? Like, not all the time, but I'm not mad at categories, especially if I go to the grocery store. I need categories. And so I think when necessary, there should be categories for particular things. I've never, and just candidly, maybe because of the different worlds that I travel in, I've never felt like I had to have that type of casing, right? And whether that's even denominationally or doctrinally, I've noticed that because of the different worlds that I travel in, maybe some of what Tim was saying about being culturally sensitive, I know that certain terms are triggers, and I navigate in a lot of different worlds, and these terms become triggers that instantly shut off the audience and the listener. And so I think because of that, it's just been easier for me to just function as a follower of Jesus and then move from there and see what I'm dealing with and where I'm going. And hopefully the particular groups or evangelicals, so to speak, will say, what he does affirm these same things, but he's not using the name, and find kinship and beauty there.
Yeah.
Well, in your earlier point about, the guy who asked you, are you a Christian? And you say, let's back up, right? Even more so, are you an evangelical? Let's complicate the question, right? And let's have some nuance to, I feel like I encounter this a lot in my world where people want to put me in a box, right? And they assume in the university setting, they often realize very quickly I'm not one of them, but they're binary. So they think that I'm not one of them, so I must be this, right? And I want to have the follow-up question. Well, no, there's not a label. Let's talk about who I am and what our relationship looks like.
Okay. We have another question that, I'm sorry, Tim, I think is for you. Is fracturing just an inevitable result of the fall? Why try to mend it?
Oh, well, yeah.
It's an easy one.
Wait, if fracturing is the result of fall, why try what?
Why try to mend it? Isn't this just inevitable
Yeah,
that we
well,
will
you
become
know,
fractured and?
I'm not trying to be funny, but I will be here. I said, so yeah, Jesus, why did you come from heaven to earth, to mend it? I mean, it's fracture. I mean, if Jesus thought it was worth the unbelievable cost to come and mend the fractures caused by the fall, then I think we need to be part of that too. So I'm not trying to be ironic. I don't know what else to say other than of course there's always been fracture, but I mean we're repairers of walls.
Okay. This one is, has the erosion of Christian influence in culture affected the black church more than the white church?
The erosion.
Has the erosion of Christian influence in culture affected the black church more than the white church?
So I'm not gonna. I don't think I can speak on behalf of the black church.
You're not the spokesman?
But I can say in my experience, ethnic churches kind of function independent of American Christianity. Even if they do operate within it, they still can function independently. And so some of the decisions that are made by evangelicalism as a whole may not necessarily affect the Korean church or the black church, so to speak. So because there's just a different set of cultural norms and rules and things that are held in high esteem and things that are not. And so there's just so many variances and differences that I don't know if I haven't seen that. I haven't seen it affected by everything else that's going on in mainstream evangelicalism in a negative fashion, so to speak.
The half Japanese church is doing well.
You speak for the whole.
All right. Jim, you want to get in on that?
No, well, listen, by the way, I really can't speak for the black church. But I do know that that unlike more mainstream churches, not just the African American church, but other more monoethnic churches of minority people in a culture, they serve as refuges. I don't think we white people understand that at all. They serve as refuges. So I would say during times where a particular people group feel somewhat under threat, that usually strengthens the church to some degree. And actually, some years ago, I was really taken to task for saying, I don't see, unless you are in a very, very homogeneous, I mean, if you live in a small town somewhere 20 miles from any other town, everybody in town's white, of course you're going to be a white church. But generally, I said, I think having homogeneous white churches doesn't seem to me very justifiable today. But having homogeneous non-white churches does, and I got clobbered for that. And I said, I just don't think you have to you understand the role that churches will play for people who actually they are minorities here, and they don't feel, sometimes they feel that they need a refuge.
What was the complaint? I don't understand.
Well, the complaint is it's not fair. I mean, to say white churches need to integrate, but non-white churches don't have to. Now, I actually do think in the long run that certainly non-English speaking non-white churches better integrate because they only have a half-life of about 15 years. Their children are going to grow up, thinking in English and speaking English. So it's a little bit of an overstatement for me to say what I said. But in general, I just think that white people don't understand that the way a church can work for non-white people or minority people. That's all. And we just should not expect that all the churches should be judged the same way. And that's what Craig said. They
Yeah.
don't necessarily, the religious economy isn't the same. We're not all exactly in the same economy, that's all.
Right, okay. So this next question is, what are some common mistakes in engaging culture? Is there anything that you've seen people do that you think, John, that
I think
it's a common thing that people are doing?
people
to
assume
alienate?
too much shared knowledge and shared assumptions. I think people don't take, this is actually, I think, a missional point, but when you go overseas to do missions, you take the time to get to know the culture and understand the people, but we don't take the time to understand our own culture next door, and so we assume things, and we don't earn credibility, we just want to talk, and so I think the inability to be patient in relationships and in understanding people and understanding language is a mistake.
Yeah. Anybody else have?
Do you want to elaborate on like the common good, the way we tend to use the word common good?
Oh, yeah, so that's an example, too, and
Yeah.
we've talked about this for several years now, but as a theological matter, the claim about the common good as a cosmic theological claim, we have to, as Christians, talk about the common good, right? The common good is defined by how we name the end and the purpose of the created order. But to use that language more broadly in a culture that doesn't share those premises becomes very complicated. So I think one mistake is Christians talking about the common good of the country. I don't know what that is. If we tried to name, if we walked out those doors and found the first 10 people outside and said, what is the common good of our country? We're not going to have agreement about that. And so it becomes a very complicated linguistic point to talk about the common good in politics or the common good of our country. And that's okay. It's a change, but you wouldn't assume that in a missional context elsewhere. You would have to show the common good.
Right, okay.
Just personally, I think one blunder that I've made in engaging culture is not being a student and not wanting to learn, but feeling as if I was just there to teach or to deliver whatever it is that I had to say, and not realizing that I have much to learn. There's people outside of the faith that are better at my craft than I am. They're better at marriage than I am. They're better at a lot of things than I am. And so just feeling as if I can still learn from, these people.
Okay. This is an interesting one. Should the church be skeptical about the culture of Christian celebrity? Should we ask our Christian celebrities? I mean, you guys are Christian celebrities. How do you feel about it?
I don't know any Christian celebrities.
Skeptical. Okay, well, yes. You asked.
Yeah, I mean, there is this issue of even in the people building their churches around, celebrity pastors, and not Tim Keller's church. That was totally different.
Is that the church where you found?
I became a believer. But I do think a lot of people are concerned about this. I mean, it's sort of a serious issue, don't you think, John? John?
As the non-celebrity here, yes, I do.
An outside perspective.
I think we're conflating authority and wisdom with celebrity, and that's amplified on social media. And when Christians fall into that, I mean, the wisdom of the Bible is not celebrity, right? It's in quiet and less flashy places. And I think a lot of Christians have totally bought into celebrity culture, and it has been a huge detriment to our witness, but also our internal health.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
What he said. So, should all churches aspire to do cross-cultural ministry?
Well, I did mention that I think churches should try to be as cross-cultural as their neighborhoods. Generally, I gave it, there are such places as, you know, a small town of 50 people. Actually, I know of a couple in Scotland that on the Isle of Skye with 50 people. They also have 4 Presbyterian churches. Each with, this is, by the way, this is not only, it's not fictional, by the way. And I, you know, the people all there are Highlanders, Scots. I think it'd be very hard for them to do cross-cultural, you know, ministry. So I think though in general, our neighborhoods are getting more multi-ethnic, our communities are. And almost always there's pride in the diversity in that community. Oh, look, we're diverse. But generally, the people in that community don't hang out. They're just operating alongside of each other. So if your church aspired to be about as multi-ethnic as your community, that would actually be more multi-ethnic than your community, because you'd actually have to be talking with each other and doing things together, whereas there's a tendency for those supposedly, I mean, you know, even in New York City, for example, when you have a community board meeting, don't ask me what that is, please. But if you have a local community board meeting, generally only older Jewish people show up at it. And the other different groups never show up unless they're threatened by some new development or something like that. Basically, people don't do things together, even when it's multi-ethnic. So I actually think that your church can't really aspire to be a whole lot more cross-cultural and multi-ethnic than your community, obviously. But you should aspire to be and therefore to really, in a sense, be a witness to your community, to say, look, people who out there are not getting along, in here are getting along because of the gospel.
But I think we got to be really careful about how we define community, especially here in St. Louis. Right? So for most of us, we can't define community by our municipality or by the mile radius around our church, but this is a region and this is a city. And if it might be structurally that some churches are not going to open the doors to a multi-ethnic community, but all churches here at least have to be aware of the issues that are affecting the city, and learning how to channel resources and partnerships in authentic ways. And I think that's actually something that we're not so good at in the city.
And don't forget what I actually said about, I don't believe that every kind of church, whether it's white or black or whatever, is under the same kind of obligation. In some kind of, there's not some template for every church that you've got to be, you know, a quarter black, a quarter white, a quarter Hispanic, a quarter Asian, or something like that. Nevertheless, I do think Ephesians 2 says there is we ought to be looking for every effort to show the world the gospel brings down racial barriers. That's all.
Okay, any thoughts?
Yeah, I wrestle with that. There's a tension there for me. I don't know. I haven't landed, I would say. I think, obviously, specifically, like when you're talking about black and white, the reason there's a black church is because these black people historically weren't allowed in the church with white people. So and then in modern time, or today, the idea, when we talk about diversity, what I see fleshed out most times is people of color adopting a white context, and not necessarily really a picture of diversity. So I have seen what is called transcultural churches, where it's kind of like we're creating a new kind of thing, or we're embracing aspects of people's culture. But I don't know what I don't know if there's a way per se. I'm you know, traditional black. Tim's gonna speak very concise, and he's going to teach us, and he's not going to shout and holler at me and make me feel like the fire of hell and consume me. And so my grandmother probably wouldn't like that. I don't think that's...
No. By the way, I am glad Lecrae's talking about the actual, I mean, you can talk, it wouldn't be great for it to be multi-ethnic and the actual issue. So, for example, my Hispanic members, if they bring a Hispanic guest to church, before they hear me preach, they have to get them ready. They have to say, you know, in spite of what it sounds like, he really does love Jesus. by the way, I knew you'd like that joke, so I told her. But do you see that inside that joke, you say, oh, yeah. So what can Tim do there to not be too white in his preaching style? And the answer is you still have to stretch. And but Lecrae is absolutely right. A lot of urban churches that say, oh, look how multiracial we are, every black member will be on the website. They'll be on that website in just about every still.
Yeah.
And then you look and say, well, are they on the elder board? And are they really having a say in how the worship goes? But the real problem, by the way, in a church like that, nobody will be completely satisfied with the worship. And if anybody is totally satisfied, then you can talk all you want about diversity, and you're not really, doing it. So it isn't for everybody. But I tell you, the Ephesians 2, if you can pull some of it off, it's a powerful witness to others.
Yeah.
Okay, this one's a tough one. Does the church's responsibility to the issue of abortion need to change? And I think maybe that means just making it the ultimate priority over everything, to the point that you can just say, well, I voted for this person because abortion, and the conversation's over. And you don't have to consider, which a lot of people do, they don't have to consider other things like race, for example, like racism.
I just think we should remain faithful to the text, remain faithful to what God calls us to remain faithful to. And, all of the issues that are a red flag to God should be a red flag to us. All of the issues that He cares and is compassionate about should be issues that we care and are compassionate about. And so I don't think we should be single issue Christians by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
Let's quit while we're ahead.
What he
We got
said-
applause. Don't talk to us yet.
We got applause for the abortion one. This is for Lecrae.
Uh-oh.
Can
I defer to
Lecrae
John.
can Lecrae speak to the lyrics in "Can't Stop Me Now"? What accountability do we have as kingdom citizens?
Accountability do we have in
As kingdom citizens.
make it brief? Can't Stop Me Now, a lament for everything that I experienced in a particular time period where, I am addressing doubt, addressing, racial injustice, addressing depression, and yeah, I think Sarah Groves, she had mentioned that the artist's unique space in all of in society is that we get to encompass every aspect of the faith, the lamenting, like the psalmist, the laments, the praises, the full truth, and bear all and not hide anything, and that's kind of what I lean toward. I'm not necessarily saying that needs to be done by everybody or by people outside of the artistic community, but that's something that I felt passion to do, is to bear all in music, and so that's why I did.
Okay. I'm just told this is somehow the last question. I don't know how we've already. I have so many more questions for you guys. Tim, you wrote a book about this, I think. Does the way we think about our career mission and our vocation need to change?
That's actually a little hard. I wish, well, we can't, I'm going to have to guess here because I don't know what you think it is now. I don't know what the questioner thinks it is right now. I would say yes, because I have a pretty negative assessment of where we are on. I'd say Christians are probably not a lot different than anyone else. In our society, basically career is about personal advancement. It's not about service. I know that because I see Christians taking jobs that they either don't like or they're not particularly good at compared to something else they like better and they might be better at, but it doesn't pay as well. And yet they probably would, you know, a good example, well, I won't give you a good example, but I see that at least in Manhattan all the time. See a lot of folks who, they're Christians and they certainly want to give their money away once they make it. But they, you know, the gleaning principle in the Bible said, if you have a field, you don't harvest it out to the very edges and then say, now I'll be a philanthropist. You actually, you leave a lot of the sheaves there so the poor can come by and just, you know, pick it up themselves, work and support themselves. And I think the idea that I need to make as much money as I can and have a high status and big home and all that, and then I'll be very generous, when actually I could have just been a public school teacher or something like that. That's gleaning to me. In other words, what you're doing is you're going to make a lot less money. In a sense, you're going to be giving back immediately. You're going to be giving back just as you do something that just doesn't bring a lot of status and money into it. But maybe you're good at it, maybe it's a need, and therefore you are seeing your job as a true vocation. Vocation means it's not your idea, you're called to it. And a career is all about my personal advancement. Now, maybe you think, I don't know what you think, actually, questioner, sorry about this, but I think that Christians are basically treating money and jobs the way everybody else is. And so I do think we do have to get back Luther's idea of vocation, including what Martin Luther would say is God feeds every living thing. How does that happen? So if you're eating today, God fed you. You say, that's funny, the food didn't appear on the table. You know, I bought this from the grocer and somebody sliced it and somebody cooked it and somebody did all it right. And therefore all of those so-called menial tasks are ways that God is caring for his creation, feeding you. And therefore, as Luther said, is the humblest farm girl milking the cow is doing God's work. It's a vocation. So getting that idea back so that all forms, blue collar as well as white collar work is seen as having dignity, we're a long way from that.
Okay. Isn't part of the reimagination also that vocation is something we do together and that we build and we create not to own but to give it away in some sense? And I think this goes back to this idea of fear we were talking about earlier, but there's this sense of control and ownership. And I'm thinking of a story of a national ministry that we would all be able to name where the founder of the ministry was angrily reaching over to the table of the new president and grabbing him by the shirt and saying, you are ruining everything I built, as if it was his in the first place. And I think that when we see vocation as building to give away, as looking to the next generation, as we're planting seeds that people who will come after us will help to harvest, and that's not about us.
Yep.
Well, you mentioned something about 2 feet when we were outside. 2 feet in both worlds or something.
Lecrae's asking me well, this is actually something John talked about. We have a tendency to say I've got 1 foot in the church and 1 foot in my job, which sounds like you're saying that I'm a Christian at church and in my job I kind of seal my faith off for my work, when actually you need to have 2 feet in the church and 2 feet in your job as a Christian. And that's what I was trying to say, and that's also part of what we're talking about here.
I'm gonna give Lecrae the last word because actually I feel like you do this really well.
Oh yeah.
Right? I mean, where did you get the courage to, you've talked about how it's not always easy and what you've dealt with.
In terms of vocation?
Yeah, in terms of really following your calling and standing up for what you believe and saying things that are unpopular.
Yeah. I think that's, in some senses, that's the nature of hip-hop music or rap music. It's always prophetic. It's calling out something, it's saying something about something in its genesis, maybe not now, but in its genesis, that's really what it was. And as far as it being, I really do, I did have to come to a place where I realized that, if you, I read a book, I forgot the author's name, it's called Imagine, but he just had mentioned he was a writer maybe not for the Rolling Stone, but somewhere along those lines, and he went to like Woodstock, and he saw all these artists and just a sea of people listening to this perspective, and he said, here's all these people out here hearing the perspective of these artists, but the perspective that would most benefit them from a biblical worldview, a Christian worldview, is not on that stage. And where is that worldview? It's somewhere isolated at a Christian festival somewhere. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's somewhere isolated. And so he said, why aren't we on those stages? And, you know, talking about the same things that they're talking about, you know, love, relationships, society, war, peace, whatnot, but giving a different vantage point. And that impassioned me to say, how do I get on those stages? And I'm not running from these stages, but I think there's a void on the ones that, you know, the world outside the church are hearing from.
All right. Well, that was a great place to end. So thank you, all of you, for an amazing conversation.
Let's thank our guests this evening for their time and their wisdom. Kirsten Powell, John Anazu, Tim Keller, and Lecrae. Let's give them another round of applause.